specifics of the policy proposal. So here's an overview. I'll talk about the causes of unemployment, the appropriate goals for a sovereign government, and by that we mean what we've been talking about all day. One with a sovereign floating exchange rate non-convertible currency. Costs of unemployment, Bill was getting into this in his last comment. Some lessons from the New Deal, which we gradually forgot. And then abandoning the commitment to full employment, and this is almost the exact title of a book written by Bill Mitchell that is very good talking about this period. And then Pavlina will take over and talk about the job guarantee program in both theory and practice, and how this can be used to achieve what we think are the appropriate goals of a sovereign government, and contrast that with the view that growth alone is an appropriate goal, and then conclude. So anyway, the causes of unemployment, I wanted to look at two different kinds of problems. The first is short-run causes of unemployment. For example, we find ourselves in a deep financial crisis with unemployment rates that are approaching Great Depression levels, and what causes that. And then turn to, over the long run, we also operate with chronic unemployment. That is, we don't normally achieve full employment, and I'll talk about two problems there. First, demand gaps, and second, structural unemployment, that is, growth without job creation. So, in the current crisis, we lost over 8 million, approaching 9 million jobs already, and I put already down because I don't believe we're anywhere near through the crisis. I think this is 1931. That is, we're 2 years into the crisis, and we could very well see continued job loss for many years. But even if we only take the official projections of the so-called experts who do believe that we're starting on the road to recovery, even they agree that unemployment is going to remain high for years. So even if it doesn't get worse, they are saying the best case scenario is very high unemployment for a long time. The lost opportunities from this period, Warren is talking about the lost output and so on. Of course, we've got that. But we also are losing opportunities for people who should have been coming into the labor force in the past 2 years. For example, my college graduates who are finding it very difficult to get any kind of job, much less a decent job. We have people who have had to take part-time employment rather than full-time employment. And of course, career advancement has been hindered by the downturn. So there are lots of lost opportunities because of the crisis. I think that if we do a careful assessment of the number of jobs that we need right now, it's probably well above 20 million jobs, because not only do we have to replace the jobs that have been lost and make up for the jobs that should have been created to take care of the people who would have come into the labor force if it had been operating at a higher capacity, but also, even at the business cycle peak back in 2007, we were nowhere near full employment. So to provide enough jobs to take care of those and get us to something close to full employment, we're going to need 20 million jobs, well over 20 million jobs probably. And just contrast that with what Obama was promising when he came into office. We're going to either create or save 2 to 3 million jobs. Obviously, it's far too little. Nobody really is looking at big enough numbers. I am told by people who work with politicians in Washington that a new jobs bill is still possible, but they're talking about tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's not going to be adequate. Nobody is thinking on the scale of the kind of program we need. We need a massive number of jobs. Now, the problem is that Washington, during the first 2 years of the crisis, really wasn't focused on job creation. It wasn't focused on Main Street. We all know it was focused on saving Wall Street. Maybe it needed to do that. We probably have different opinions over whether that was necessary or not. But in any case, the problem is that right now, both the politicians and the population at large believe we've already spent so much money. How can we possibly afford to create 20 million jobs now? It's too late. We're not going to be able to save Main Street because we spent too much on Wall Street. And so I think that this confusion about what's affordable has become the major barrier. Now, there always is a barrier to proposing this program. We've always encountered resistance to the idea that the government should be responsible for ensuring full employment, and we'll try to make that case. But now this affordability and, oh no, we've already spent so much money on Wall Street that we can't possibly afford a reasonably sized employment program, that now the deficit hysteria is the main barrier to getting us out of this deep recession that I think will continue for many years. So that is sort of our short-run unemployment problem, dealing with crisis and getting things going. But we have had a long-run employment problem, and that really results from two really different causes. First is, and Bill was alluding to this, and this is dealt with in his book that I mentioned, that unemployment came to be used as a policy tool. That is, unemployment was not a problem to be tackled by government policy. No, unemployment became the policy tool to deal with the supposed problem of inflation. So policy actually was targeting unemployment, using that to keep inflation rates low. And so I know all the economists, or anyone who studied economics, knows about the NAIRU approach. We're trying to get unemployment up high enough that it will prevent inflation or prevent inflation from accelerating. And so that is the use of unemployment as a buffer stock. That is, and Warren described this process, those unemployed people are supposed to help keep wages from rising. And then that helps keep the pressure off prices, and so it keeps inflation low. Or Marx called it the reserve army of the unemployed. And so it's sort of ironic that you had people like Milton Friedman adopt a Marxist ideology that we need that unemployed reserve army to keep labor in check. Okay, so that was one aspect of the problem. And then there is another aspect, a structural unemployment problem. I'm not going to read the long quote here, but the ILO has produced a lot of research on structural unemployment, and they noted in 2007, the date is important because this is at the peak of the business cycle, that we had 200 million unemployed people around the world. No doubt this is a vast undercount. Okay, I don't want to argue about that, but obviously it is a very large number. And they emphasize this is in spite of strong economic growth and unemployment. Every region in the world has to face major labor market challenges. So what they're saying is that strong economic growth is not a solution to this unemployment problem. It is going to exist, even with strong economic growth. Okay, and why is that? It is because growth fuels productivity growth, which they said averaged 26% up to that business cycle peak over the past decade, on average around the world. But jobs had only grown by 16.6%. And meanwhile, of course, populations are also growing. And so the unemployment problem is becoming worse in spite of very strong productivity growth. In fact, it's not in spite of, it's because of. It's because labor is becoming more productive that we don't need as many workers in order to have economic growth. And again, the economists in here will recognize this as David Ricardo's machine problem. So David Ricardo pointed this out back in the 1820s. He said, this is going to be a continuous problem that through labor-saving technological advance, we're going to create a growing pool of unemployed labor that we can't put to use. So Ricardo was very pessimistic about the long-run outcomes. We were able to put this off for a very long time because we were able to find ways around this problem by opening up new markets, creating new sources of demand. But it has become a chronic global problem that growth alone will not create enough jobs. Okay? So what do we think should be the goals of a sovereign government? Now, I think there are many. We have mentioned several times that we conceive of, in John Kenneth Galbraith's terminology, there is a public purpose. So there are things we want the government to provide for us. Okay? Maybe we want decent Social Security for the aged. But I'm taking a step back from that and just saying, in the most general terms possible, what are the most important things that a sovereign government should do for us? Well, it ought to ensure that we have full use of domestic resources, and it has the fiscal capacity to do this. Economic growth and promoting economic growth alone is not going to give us full capacity use. So we think that government ought to be focusing on full employment, because it's much more important to have labor fully employed than it is to have, say, our agricultural resources fully employed, although we ought to aim for that too. But let's make full employment a primary goal, and as Warren keeps emphasizing, for political reasons, not really for economic reasons, we need to make price stability also a goal. And the problem is that for a very long time, orthodoxy has thought these two goals are completely in conflict. You cannot have both of these at the same time. You either can have full employment, and then you're going to have inflation, or you can have price stability, but you're going to have a lot of unemployment. Okay? So what we're trying to do is to promote a program that can give you full employment with price stability, okay? And that this should be the goal of sovereign government, and our argument is it has the capacity to do this. Okay, Bill sort of got into this in his last comment, and because I presume most people here are not academic economists, what I'm going to say is pretty obvious to you, but to academic economists, this is all new. Now, they recognize that unemployment does have a cost, and that is, okay, you don't fully utilize, you get these open gaps, as Bill was talking about. All right, we lose some net income, because those people could have been working and earning income and producing goods and services. GDP could have been higher, and so that's what economists focus on. And it's significant, okay? And as Bill and Warren have been arguing, the losses in the past 2 years are just tremendous in terms of lost GDP, okay? So that's one thing. But the sociologists and political scientists would point to these other things, which are also huge, and they're almost always ignored by economists. Okay, just run through very quickly: poverty, social isolation, crime, regional deterioration, because unemployment usually is regionally concentrated, and all the Americans know we can identify parts of the country that suffer from unemployment to a greater extent than others. Health issues, family breakdown, school dropouts, this is well established in the literature outside economics. It promotes violence, ethnic hostility, even terrorism. The loss of human capital, because when people are unemployed for long periods of time, they become unemployable. Partly because of behavioral changes, but also because of the way that potential employers perceive them. 2 years unemployed, I don't want to take a chance on you. So whether it's a real human capital loss or a perceived capital loss, it will prevent them from having the same job opportunities that they would have had if we hadn't gone through this 2-year period. Okay, and hysteresis, long-term unemployed become unemployable, okay, because of these, all of these things that I'm mentioning here, okay. You become homeless, and this is going to have a very long-term impact on your employability. Okay, benefits of full employment. Again, the economists are going to point to the first one. They produce goods and services. They add to GDP. Of course, that is a big benefit. But there are lots of other social and political benefits of achieving full employment. On-the-job training and skill development. So if you're employed, you will be increasing your human capital. Poverty alleviation, I'll mention this again in a few minutes. Community building, social networking. Pavlina will talk very briefly about Argentina. We went down there and we saw the benefits to communities of creating jobs in areas that had no jobs before a jobs program was created. Social, political, and economic stability are all promoted by full employment. And then finally, there's this notion that our colleague Matt Forstater has written about, and unfortunately he was going to be here, but he couldn't. There are positive feedbacks reinforcing dynamics. So in a sense, there is a multiplier effect of all these things. So if you just add up the benefits, okay, we get more GDP, we get poverty alleviation, and so on, there also is a multiplied impact greater than the sum of these individual benefits from achieving full employment. Okay, well, we went through a period similar to what we're going through now, and of course, we had 2 major reforms that I think had a huge impact on our experience in the post-war period. The first was that finance was downsized and constrained. Read John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash, and it will sound extremely familiar. The account he gives of the kinds of financial institutions, innovations, practices that were all put in place, the rising inequality, the growth of finance, all previous to the 1929 crash, sound an awful lot like what we went through in the past decade. Okay, anyway, we massively downsized finance, and mostly that was not the government downsizing, the markets downsized it. This time around, we prevented the markets from doing the downsize. The markets wanted to downsize Wall Street, okay, and if we had left them alone, they would have done it, but we stopped them this time. And then we constrained them. And this helped to promote financial and economic stability in the post-war period. The other kind of reform that we had was the direct job creation. We created about 13 million jobs in the alphabet soup of programs that we had. So I've listed some of these here. And the unemployment rate was greatly reduced by these programs. And Marshall has written on this because I know some writers have argued that it didn't reduce the unemployment rate, but that's because they counted these 13 million people as still unemployed, even though they're showing up to work. So it was a political decision made now to understate the true impact of the New Deal. Now, the problem is that gradually this first reform was eroded in the post-war period. Because financial institutions found ways around the constraints, which of course is natural profit-seeking behavior, by growing competition from unregulated financial institutions, the so-called shadow banking system, and a regulatory response to that. The commercial banks that are heavily regulated can't compete with the shadow banks that are lightly regulated, so we need to reduce the regulations. Okay, so for all those reasons, we got rid of most of the New Deal constraints on finance. And of course, the problem with the second, the direct job creation, is that in the post-war fairly rapid economic growth, we came to believe we don't need these programs. Growth alone, trickle down, rising tide raises all boats, all these arguments that the growth will create the jobs, so we don't need the government to engage in direct job creation. In the post-war period, for the first 2 decades or so, we had the golden age of capitalism, the highest sustained growth rate. We had no financial crises. Okay, a 20-year period. Normally in U.S. history, every 20 years we had a depression. Okay, we not only didn't have a depression, we had no financial crises. Okay, so we had minor recessions, but we recovered quickly. But it wasn't true just for the U.S., and Bill could tell you the same story about Australia, and it wasn't just true for the developed nations. The developing world also had the highest sustained growth it had ever experienced. In fact, it was better than our Industrial Revolution. The developing world was growing faster than the UK did during the Industrial Revolution. So in a sense, it was a golden age of capitalism. We had a commitment to high employment. Now, Bill would talk about a commitment to full employment in Australia, and they probably came close to achieving that. In the U.S., we never really embraced that, but we did embrace high employment. Okay, we achieved unemployment rates for white males of 3%. Okay, almost as good as Australia, but it was only white males. Okay, we were not really committed to full employment, including women and especially African Americans. And so their unemployment rates were much higher than this. We had a lot of people misname the 1946 Act. They say the Full Employment Act, but it wasn't the Full Employment Act. It was the Employment Act, okay? But it did commit the government to trying to maintain low unemployment for most groups, if not full employment. We had the creation of the U.S. middle class over this period that was sustained by jobs and decent wages. The problem is, Minsky started writing in 1957, arguing that, yes, we have created the conditions for economic stability, a generally high-wage economy, a high-consumption economy, constrained finance economy, and all of these things are conducive to rapid economic growth with financial and economic stability. The problem is stability is destabilizing. Okay, so he predicted that the financial institutions are going to gradually break free of these constraints. They're going to engage in riskier behavior. And he also foresaw that we could start to get inflationary pressures building even before we get to full employment in this kind of economy. I don't have time to go into that. But anyway, in 1962, in spite of this golden age, the U.S. rediscovered poverty, found out that actually we still had poverty in 1962. Okay, and so this was sort of a shock in Washington. It's a book by Michael Harrington pointed this out. And so they decided that we need a war on poverty. And Minsky actually was involved in this war on poverty. He was close to Shriver and to Hubert Humphrey, and he wrote lots of letters to them. Actually wrote papers and was writing a book on poverty and employment at this time. He was at UC Berkeley. And he said, the problem with the war on poverty is that you're focusing on the supply side. You're trying to stimulate the supply side. Economic growth is going to create jobs. And then we just need to make sure we have workers that are ready for the jobs. So we need to emphasize more training and getting people to change their behavior, get rid of the culture of poverty, the Moynihan thesis, and so on. And then we'll have welfare for the people who aren't able to work. Okay, so that's what the war on poverty was. Minsky said, this is going to fail. And he wrote letters to all these people, and he said, the war on poverty is not going to reduce poverty. It's going to fail. Why? Because first, he said, it's demoralizing. You're telling people who are unemployed and poor that you got to reform yourself first, okay? And then maybe you'll be able to get a job without supplying them a job. So even if they did it, even if they went to school, got educated, got training, we're not creating any jobs for you. Okay? There was no significant job component in the war on poverty, and Minsky calculated that if we just supplied one minimum wage job to each poor family, we would lift 2/3 of all poor families out of poverty. Even if the minimum wage pays a total annual income below the poverty line, the family is still getting income from other sources. And so he actually, went into the data and calculated one minimum wage job per family would eliminate 2/3. So instead of the war on poverty, he said, give them jobs. You'll get rid of 2/3 of poverty. Later, Stephanie and I calculated the same thing in the Clinton boom, came up with exactly the same number. One minimum wage job per family would eliminate 2/3 of poverty. Okay? The final objection that Minsky had was he said, okay, you're going to provide welfare, maybe that's a good thing. The problem is Americans are not going to support a generous enough welfare safety net in order to lift people out of poverty. And of course, that prediction turned out to be true. Yes, we gave welfare, but it was never enough to lift a family out of poverty. What we really needed to do was give them jobs, and Americans, he argued, will support that. Americans believe that if you work, you ought to be able to get out of poverty. But Americans don't support giving welfare to lift people out of poverty. Now, the poverty rate did fall, and some people have wrongly said it was the war on poverty, but it wasn't. It had nothing to do with it. Okay, if you actually look at the data, the reduction of poverty rates from 1962 to 1973, which was a large reduction of the poverty rate, fell almost in half. It was almost entirely due to Social Security payments to the elderly. So we greatly reduced the poverty rates of the elderly. That had nothing to do with the war on poverty. Okay, it was Social Security. And the other was the Civil Rights Movement that increased the labor market outcomes mostly for African Americans. Okay, and that was a long-term trend, actually. That had been going on since World War II. It was just a continuation of the trend. And actually, for African Americans, the poverty rate continued to fall till Reagan. For the U.S. as a whole, it stopped falling in 1973. Okay? So anyway, the war on poverty did fail, just as Minsky argued that it would. Okay, from 73 forward, the U.S. and Bill argues in his book, most, or is it Bill, all other developed nations abandoned the commitment to high employment and full employment outside the U.S. And this was associated with the rise of free market ideology. We can all remember Reagan's campaign against welfare queens who supposedly drive Cadillacs. Government is the problem. The supply side trickle-down economics is all we need. Clinton arguing that we need to end welfare as we know it. And I actually think there was a very good aspect to Clinton's agenda here. He said we need to change the way that Americans look at poor people. We need to make them see them as deserving poor, and the only way to do that is to get them off welfare and into jobs. I think that was completely correct. The problem is Clinton didn't give them any jobs. Okay? He said, we're going to take away welfare, now you go get a job, but he didn't provide the jobs. If he had provided the jobs, it would have been, I think, a successful policy. Bush, of course, talking about the ownership society. If you're interested, you can go to the Levy Institute. I wrote a paper in 2005 that said this promotion of the ownership society, for most Americans, the only thing they own is their house. And what we have got going on in the United States, writing this in 2005, is a way that's going to ensure that Americans are just going to lose their homes. Okay, so it's actually going to reduce ownership in society. And then finally, under Clinton, the Democrats sort of very strangely and ironically became the party of fiscal responsibility, which has always been the role of the Republicans. Now it became the primary policy of the Democrats. We got to balance the budget. And they learned the wrong lesson from the Clinton years when we ran a budget surplus because the economy performed very well in terms of growth. Of course, it was a household debt fueled boom. which was absolutely destined to eventually collapse. But the lesson they learned was, budget surpluses lead to rapid growth. Okay, when actually it's the rapid growth that created the budget surpluses. So anyway, Democrats have become the party that's always advocating tightening fiscal policy. And finally, we had the rise of something that takes a variety of names. Jamie Galbraith called it the predator state. Many people call it financialization or neoconservatism or neoliberalism. Minsky actually called it the rise of money manager capitalism. And that over the past decade, well, longer period than that, but over the past decade has built up the conditions that finally led to this crisis. This is my last slide, yes. Now, Pavlina is going to take over and talk about the specific policy proposal.
Okay, this is the final stretch, so hanging there. So today, most of the day, we have mostly focused on our operational understanding of government spending. So now we get to the vision. How do we utilize this operational understanding of government expenditures to get past the obsession with the financial ratios, with these numerical measures of government success, and actually get to the real thing? Talk about financial ratio in context of what's happening to the real economy. So our vision is, I'd say, a Smithian vision, Adam Smith's vision. Adam Smith said that the wealth of a nation rests within its people. And this is what Bill was talking about, not wasting human resources. So how do we do that? So this is what we think of features of responsible fiscal policy. We don't use unemployment and human livelihoods as means to check inflation. This whole idea that Randy was addressing, that somehow unemployment is a necessary evil and we have to put up with it in order to maintain price stability. There is the empirical evidence, first of all, is very spotty on this. Economists constantly redefine their NAIRU or their inflationary barriers, and you look at the data, it's very difficult to find this particular level. So let's just measure fiscal policy in terms of employment creation effects. This is how we tend to see things. And so long as we're living in a monetary production economy where the access to livelihood is a wage-paying job, then that should be the criteria for responsible fiscal policy. But we could debate that. These are the questions that sort of emerge from the historical perspective that Randy provided, and also you will see how we believe that this kind of approach utilizes this operational knowledge that we've just built to build a very sustainable system. So we are redefining sustainability in terms of employment creation, price stability, as opposed to certain debt GDP ratios. We have to switch the conversation. We really need to reorient our thinking about fiscal policy. I like to argue that it's done in a backwards way, that what we are attempting to do is plug some demand gap, whatever that means. And Randy was alluding to this. We fix some growth rate. We come up with measures of potential output. We don't really know how much labor went into the production of that potential output, what happened to the structure of the economy, how much was output produced by labor replacing technology. We have no sense of the sort of dynamic forces that are determining output. So we like to measure potential output in terms of men and women put to work. So the way to flip fiscal policy is not to target a demand gap, because that's not very clear what that means, but instead to target a labor demand gap. And we are arguing that this delivers more bang for the buck. We do not know today how much more, even if we agreed that maybe deficit spending is sustainable, right? Even in the most sympathetic, I would say, commentators to the deficit say, look, we need to push further. We got to deficit spend. We still don't know how much we need to spend. How large deficit spending is large enough to produce the real outcomes that we're aiming for. So what we're proposing is that we actually tie deficit spending directly to the objective, and you know exactly how much you need to spend. How many people do you want to put to work? Obama wants to save and create 3 to 4 million people. Okay, put them to work. You know exactly what your wage bill is going to be. You're going to find out your materials and your costs. If you want to create 10 million jobs, you know what your budget is going to be, and you have directly achieved the goal, as opposed to going backwards through this vision of producing growth and hoping that somehow the growth will lift up all boats and trickle down to the economy and produce the kind of job growth. So we see responsible fiscal policy as an employment stabilization via direct job creation, and we see direct job creation as a permanent feature of policy making. It's because the objectives are to guarantee full employment, not for the short run, but also for the long run. In other words, this is very different from depression economics, which is Paul Krugman's, euphemism. That finally the return of Keynesianism is because we're in a depression. No, we would like to achieve sustainable fiscal policy throughout the short and the long run. Okay, so what is the job guarantee in theory? Let me just synthesize some of these ideas very quickly. There is an alternative to the NAIRU. We can use unemployable or employed pool of labor as the buffer stock, not the reserve army of the unemployed. So I'll explain a little bit what that means. This is the job guarantee. Bill refers to this program as a job guarantee. There are various other, public service employment, direct job creation, you name it. But what that basically means is that you provide an unconditional offer of a public sector job to at a minimum wage to anyone who wants to work. This way, as a permanent program, an unconditional program, it maintains and it attains and maintains full employment. Okay, so essentially the features of the job guarantee is that this is a bubble-up policy. This is not trickle-down economics. It is a policy that hires off the bottom. It deals precisely with those that are either never employed or the ones that are last into a job and first out of a job. So it's a bottom-up approach. It operates with flexible markets via a buffer stock mechanism. So this is the part that we need to explain how the job guarantee serves as this buffer stock. And I'm using, Bill Mitchell's terminology here, who basically, made the case a number of years ago that just like any other, commodity buffer stock, you can stabilize the price of that stock by simply selling it when it is, the price is too high, buying it when the price starts falling. So you can envision labor as being a kind of a buffer stock where you offer an employment to all those who want a job at a base wage. And as that would be your stimulus, essentially, that produces growth. As that demand trickles up to the economy and the private sector rejuvenates and starts demanding labor, then the private sector will be able to hire from the public sector pool by bidding up the wage. Once the private sector has been saturated or has hired as much as they desire, if you observe sort of an overheating economy, inflationary pressures, the private sector decides that it needs to downsize, then those workers will be laid off, and instead of moving into unemployment, they move into the public sector buffer stock. So essentially, what this program does is it establishes a wage floor to labor. Today, the wage floor of labor is essentially zero, because you can hire somebody that is willing to work at a premium above the zero wage that they are earning at the very moment. So this is, we could talk more about this sort of mechanism, but this is a program that then deals with any kind of unemployment that you are trying to solve. Cyclical unemployment, the long-term structurally unemployed, seasonal unemployment, as well as the entrance into the labor market. My college students that are looking for a job. The benefits of this program, of course, is that it also creates an employable pool of labor. and it maintains and enhances human capital. We like to always argue that this program offers both a job as well as an opportunity to improve skill, to train, for training and education. It's a targeted program, as opposed to this indiscriminate aggregate demand management program, plan that we seem to be implementing today, or the way fiscal policy is conducted today. It's very targeted. You know where the unemployed are. You take the contract to the worker. You deal with distress areas. You look at their resources, you look at their needs, and you mobilize them. So it's a very targeted approach. It also is an approach that takes workers as they are. You're not trying to educate people and hopefully they will become employable in the eyes of the private sector and find employment. You provide the opportunity, and then also you provide other opportunities to train to become employable and transition to the private sector. So this program can be seen as a transitional employment program. It's a safety net that captures the unemployed and prepares them for private sector work if they so desire. Of course, the projects have to be useful and valuable. We all think that there are plenty of useful things to do. So, just to summarize, it's a voluntary program. Nobody is forced into working for this job guarantee. The spending level is always at the right level. However many people show up for work, that's how much you spend. You don't spend more than necessary, and you don't underspend in a sense. And it has a transformative impact on workers, on firms, on communities, and on the economy. I think I've already said a lot of the things that I've listed here. Firms also benefit from this because it replaces unemployed with employable workers. It reduces their training costs. They have a visible pool of labor. They know what these potential private sector workers have worked, what kind of experience they have received, and so they benefit from that as well. This is a policy that can lift the floor. So going back to the earlier discussion about taxing the rich and how do we redistribute, well, you can improve the income distribution by lifting the floor. And if you set the wage at the appropriate level, then that would lift people out of poverty. Okay, it's a permanent program. And by permanent program, again, I just want to emphasize that it doesn't mean more demand. It might mean better distributed demand. Okay, the job guarantee, the macro stability, just let me touch on this once again, that the wage provides an inbuilt inflation control mechanism. This is because the compensation package establishes the floor. This is the floor to a standard of living for the entire nation. Again, you spend on this fixed price floating quantity rule. This is what the previous speakers were alluding to previously. You fix the price of labor and then let the budget float with the needs of the economy. When the economy decelerates, the budget expands as those workers enter the public sector. So it has an expansionary effect. When the economy grows, the budget automatically contracts as workers move out into private sector jobs. So that's the counter-cyclical mechanism. And wages become benchmark for the prices to the extent that wages are an input of production of all reproducible assets, then that will serve as an anchor to prices as well. Okay, so full employment and price stability also promotes currency stability. And the idea here is that we are establishing better anchors than the current system. We use labor as that anchor. This is not a solution for all labor market problems. We can use this program as an institutional vehicle, as a program to address specific goals. You may want urban, inner city renewal. Maybe you want green infrastructure investment. You can use those resources then to direct them to the specific things you want to do. There will be other things that you might want to be, deal with, labor market discrimination, other things. This is not a panacea for all labor market problems. But it's definitely better than the unemployment buffer stock. So let me very briefly talk about Argentina. Argentina is one of the most recent cases of implementing a program that mimics the job guarantee. It is not job guarantee. I want to emphasize it's actually a limited program. But it was a large-scale program. It was implemented quite quickly and, in our view, effectively. So we have been studying this program and looking at the macro effects, as well as going to projects and visited those projects to see what they did and how they impacted people. Now, even though it was a smaller program, it still exhibited the features that I was just discussing of this sort of macro universal job guarantee program. The Argentinian program was implemented as an emergency measure. It was depression economics. You know, people took to the streets. They demanded from their government jobs. The government gave them jobs. And they gave them jobs. The program was running, up and running in a few months. Just like the New Deal era experience, we were able to organize things to do for the unemployed relatively quickly. It was a part-time job. It offered 4 hours of community work to the unemployed heads of households at a minimum hourly wage. And 2 million people showed up for work. This is about 13% of the labor force in Argentina. And Argentina, granted, is coming down from 25% of unemployment. So they, their levels were close to our real actual unemployment levels, but higher than our official levels. This program had a considerable impact on the poor and especially on women and minorities who had access to this job. It was counter-cyclical. It stabilized output, prices, and currency. You look at the data and you find all of those indicators stabilize. GDP growth was between 8 and 12% from 2003 to 2007, and only in the last year it dipped to 5%. So it's job creation that produces growth, as opposed to the other way around. The government budget moved into surplus. There are a variety of things going on there, but of course you're generating a large amount of incomes which are being taxed. The multiplier effect of this program, I've looked at some of the measures, and some of the more conservative measures, is 2.57, meaning that for every dollar spent on the program, you're creating $2.6 of output. Now, and what happened? Did people get stuck in the public sector? No. Actually, what happened was that as the economy recovered, many workers transitioned into private sector jobs. It was organized in a very interesting way. I can tell you about all those institutional details, how it was administered, how the resources were mobilized. But suffice to say, it was federally funded, locally administered. The government actually maintained a database of skill and experience of the unemployed, helped them transition to private sector jobs as well. And from our visits as well, it was obvious what kind of impact this program had on the poor. It empowered, it provided on-the-job training. Every project that we went to see had an adjacent room with literacy education, with training, with various other courses that they can take. I like to see this as like a new form of microfinance. As opposed to lending to people, you just give them a grant for the wages and for the materials, get them on their feet, get them to produce something. And pretty much every project that we saw was some people that set up shops, carpentry shops, or baby clothes tailoring shops, or toy shops, something that they could then sell on the market. But there were also products that were freely distributed to the poor. Lots of food kitchens, daycare center, public libraries, elder care centers for the abused, etc. Again, the employers hired from the pool, and the economy stabilized very quickly. One benefit of this was that it formalized the informal sector. In Argentina, actually, there's a very large share of the economy that's a gray economy. Those that used to work under the table, where you issued social security tax cards, they would be, when they transitioned to private sector jobs, now they were working under contract. The program established a wage floor. From all the people that transition, a sort of a wage floor, because it's a limited program, but from all the people that transitioned from the public sector job to the private sector, they were all hired at a premium. 97% of those were hired at a premium. And communities were transformed. I can give you lots of examples, but what was interesting is that the unemployed themselves proposed a lot of these projects. They were the ones that actually invented the kinds of things that they did. They did massive landfill cleanups and recycling initiatives, and on and on and on. So these are some pictures of projects that we visited, and lots of food kitchens. There were lots of poor communities, but there were things like health promotion programs, subsistence farming. There were a lot of projects outside of the greater Buenos Aires area, which we visited, that dealt with agricultural projects, water irrigation, clay pits, etc. So again, growth itself is not the appropriate target. You have to wed it to job creation. It can promote inequality. This sort of pro-growth or growth at all costs approach can promote inequality. It can harm the environment. We haven't really said anything about the environment yet. So we are really looking at a bottom-up approach that looks at full employment through direct job creation, a job guarantee. We view this as a program for shared prosperity. You could set an environmentally sustainable growth path and maintain price and currency stability. We can do it. We have done it once in the past, as have other countries in one form or another. Is the right thing to do? I think we could debate this, but I want to get back to the point about having access to a job as a basic human right. In my opinion, I think Obama just needs a Rooseveltian resolve. We could talk more about this later, but just the wage bill of hiring 20 million people at I think Warren has proposed an $8 an hour, or you could do a living wage of $10, $12 an hour. We're looking at $350 to $500 billion. Compare this to the other expenditures. But I want to emphasize, costs here are not in terms of financial costs. It's not necessarily the problem. I just want to show you that in perspective, you could deliver so much more bang for the buck in real terms if you target your programs. So we have a deficit in convictions, I think, deficit in cleverness, not necessarily an ability to fund. And let me end with a couple of quotes. One is by FDR. It says that, the liberty of a democracy is not safe if its business system does not provide employment and produce and distribute goods in such a way as to sustain an acceptable standard of living. And the last quote is a quote from Keynes, and this is something that we as academics constantly run against, and that's this idea that we have to keep 5% or 10% of the population in idleness. The conservative believe that there is some law of nature which prevents men from being employed, that it is rash to employ men or women, and that it is financially sound to maintain a tenth of the population in idleness is crazily improbable, the sort of thing which no man could believe who had not had his head fuddled with nonsense for years and years. Thank you. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, Warren reminded me that, as I've said, there have been many countries that have done this in one form or another. Bill Mitchell has been working on the South African program, but India passed a job guarantee law, which basically guarantees 100 days of community work to the unemployed. And it's a law that's still being worked out, but there is a movement out there. I mean, people are recognizing the benefits, the very many benefits of this approach. And so I think there are plenty of examples to look to.